floor to Gavin.
Campaneros and Campaneras. In stark contrast to Joseph's report, there was some good news. I was recently part of a young trade unionist delegation, May Day delegation to Cuba with the British Cuba Solidarity Campaign, and was there from the 25th of April until the 7th of May. So unfortunately I missed most of the events around the Cuban Day against homophobia and a lot of what I'd go on to talk about, but you know, hey. The delegation was part of mainly there to experience the sort of May Day in Havana at the Plaza del Revolution, which was a bloody amazing event with 2 million Cubans marching. Raul was there. But if I just quickly outline what the delegation I was part of did when we were out there. We were part of an international delegation which included brigadistas from most of Latin America, many of the Africas, South Africa, a big delegation from Nigeria, Zambia, Europe, and then in Europe, Spain, France, Ukraine, the UK. In Asia there was a delegation from China and South Korea, and for most of the brigade we stayed in a camp outside Havana with 3 nights in a hotel in Cienfuegos, which is on the south coast of the island. Beautiful place, a World Heritage Site, if I don't know if any of you've gone out there. And it's a capital of the province by the same name. We also had the opportunity to visit the Che Guevara mausoleum in Santa Clara, where his remains are now are kept along with those of 29 fellow revolutionaries that were killed during his attempt to spur an armed uprising in Bolivia in '67. We spent time doing lots of solidarity work and volunteering on the sort of farms near the camp. I spent a lot of the brigade meeting and talking to Cubans in their neighbourhoods, in their hospitals, and with the delegations from Cuban NGOs such as the Cuban Federation of Women, which has 4 million members, and I could go on. But if I get back to LGBT rights in Cuba, as many of you will be aware, equality for LGBT Cubans hasn't been a sort of doddle. In the period after the Cuban Revolution, like, homosexuality was treated as a sort of bourgeois and individualistic, a sort of hangover from the pre-revolutionary Cuba, where Havana was a sort of offshore brothel for imperialism. I would add here that homosexuality was never legal before the revolution. There was also a Catholic and machismo culture of the time, and in that period we saw the incarceration of homosexuals, including revolutionaries, into austere, what was called military units to aid production, so labour camps set up to house supposedly bourgeois elements. This period of the revolution, however, has since been condemned by Fidel as a great injustice, and further reconciliation has been made and is ongoing. We have a research project by the National Centre for Sexual Education, which Mariela Castro heads up, which I'll come on to, which is sort of looking at interviewing some of those that served in those labour camps and sort of reconciling and speaking to those people out there. But the process of the sort of legalisation of homosexuality in Cuba didn't start until 1979, and further legalisation didn't happen after that until '87, when the offence of homosexual acts in public places was removed from the penal code. And then on to '93, sex education workshops were brought in throughout the country to explain that homophobia is a sort of prejudice and that it must be eradicated. And there's good interviews that Fidel gave around the time. One with a Nicaraguan journalist called Thomas Bourget, I don't know if I pronounced that right, is quoted as saying that homosexuality is one of the natural aspects and tendencies of human beings which should be respected. He went on to say that he is absolutely opposed to any form of repression, contempt, scorn or discrimination with regard to homosexuals. Also during this time they released to the state, there was the release of the film Strawberries and Chocolate, which was a sort of state-funded film, which was very questioning how the Castro administration had treated LGBT Cubans and is generally a very well-made film, and I'd recommend people go out and see it if they haven't had the opportunity to do so already. But I would say that progression has really been expedited over the last 10 years, or the last decade, with the National Centre for Sexual Education. Under its director, Mariela Castro, given a real voice to the LGBT community in Cuba and an organised way of influencing government policy. It has worked closely with the Ministry for Health to ensure that gender reassignment surgery is available part of Cuba's universal healthcare, and it passed legislation in 2008 around that. The family code has been changed to make it clear that parents have a responsibility to support and welcome any member of their family who is LGBT, and the centre provides information to support and has a website to help support families to deal with, to come to terms with that. And I also should mention that Cuba has the lowest prevalence of HIV infection in the Americas, and one of the lowest ratios of population in the world. All HIV positive patients have access to anti-retroviral treatment, and this is in large part down to the work done by the centre, as I previously mentioned. There's also an expectation that a bill on same-sex civil unions, it will be expected to vote on shortly, possibly in the next year or so. If I now come on to the Cuban Day Against Homophobia, which has happened annually over the last 6 years and is linked to the commemoration of Idaho, which is the International Day Against Homophobia, which is celebrated on May 17th each year. This year it was celebrated with events spread between Havana and the province of Ciego de Avila throughout May. There were over 50 different events, programmed consisting of workshops, lectures and panel events, film shows, cultural and community initiatives, fiestas, festivals and a gala show. I have a program here if anybody has reasonable Spanish and can sort of understand. Many of the events considered how the activities of LGBT organisations in Cuba could better understand the challenges of Cuba society in understanding sexuality and sexual orientation issues. Other events then looked at the role and function of the National Centre for Sexual Education and the role that has. There was a presentation there on the 5 years achievements of the previous Cuban Day, the Cuban Day Against Homophobia, and there was a homage of the film that I mentioned previously called Strawberries and Chocolate. On the morning of the 11th of May, there was 500 people participate in a conga, which was a parade from the Malecon along La Rampa to the Central Pavilion in Havana. It even made it onto the BBC News. It was a sort of display of noise, colour and festivities designed to celebrate the diversity of the LGBT society and make a statement of inclusion. Once at the pavilion, Mariela Castro again addressed the crowd, speaking of the progress that was made and emphasising the need to continue the work of the revolution and ensure total inclusion of all within Cuba society, irrespective of sexual orientation or sexuality becomes a reality. There was acceptance that much work was left to do, but recognition had to be given at what had already been achieved. Making comparison with other countries that are considered more progressive by the right-wing media. Later that evening there was a Cuba Gala against homophobia hosted at the Karl Marx Theatre. A spectacular evening of entertainment was had with over 2,000 people, including a special guest in Rene Gonzalez, or if you don't know who Rene is, he was one of the Miami Five, who are 5 Cubans who had been falsely imprisoned by America for espionage, or falsely accused of espionage by the Americans. Before them also still remain in prison. The union, and I would say that the union and Cuba Solidarity campaign has had a huge influence in sort of supporting that campaign internationally. Then from the 14th of May, the focus of Idaho moved into the sort of province of the Ciego de Avila, which is about 425 kilometers outside of Havana on the southeast coast, southeast from Havana. Each year, a different province sort of is involved in the commemoration events, and this is designed to strengthen the work undertaken by organisations involved in LGBT campaigning and provide a sense of inclusion for those LGBT communities outside of the capital, Havana. Over 4 days then, a series of workshops and community initiatives were programmed, culminated in a festival of celebration of diversity on the 17th of May. What I would say to sum up is that there is always the ability for us to be influenced by the myth and spin peddled through the right-wing media outlets, attempting to convince us of rampant oppression and victimization in Cuba. But the only way to combat this is to witness firsthand the reality of life for LGBT Cubans. And I am pleased to have been fortunate enough to get some experience in seeing this progress for myself. And as Cubans have already said, you know, they appreciate there is a long way to do, but and it is still a work in progress, but much has been made by sort of up to this point. I'd also say that I'm told there'll be the possibility that next year, if there's enough interest, that the Cuba Solidarity Campaign will consider organising an LGBT study tour during this period covering Idaho. And I'd advise anybody who would be interested in the opportunity that they get on to Cuba Solidarity now, so that they look at putting that event on. And cheers.
Thank you. How are you in Cuba? Okay, so I'm going to open it up now for any Q&A if people have questions and stuff. I would just like to point out, if you want to make sure that you're heard, there's a little button on the thing in front of you that says push. You have to hold that down, and then you will be heard. So are there any questions? Okay. Yes, over the back. I'm going to take them one at a time, and once you've had a response, try not to retort and turn it into a debate. I can always circle back to you. So yes, gentleman over the back.
Thank you, thanks, Chair. First of all, thank you to both speakers for really informative and really interesting presentations. One which seemed extremely positive in terms of what was going on in Cuba, compared to the events which, Joseph, you were talking about in terms of Greece, and particularly with the trade unions there. And I was just thinking, listening to what you were saying in terms of some of the comments, which is I don't think we should be over negative. I think about some of what the trade unions are saying in Greece, because actually you're right. It does sound like the trade unions of this country back in the 70s, and some of the ways that we actually turned that around was particularly those who in this room who will remember the lesbians and gay support the mine workers, and then soon after, a few years later, lesbians and gay support the print workers, and the fact that to kind of be out there supporting the miners and the print workers, which were probably in terms of our natural supporters, that wouldn't have been the case originally, but there were battles to be won. I think that is similar to what we can do now, which is to say, well, look, although you have a struggle on your hands, we're here. We will be here to support you from Britain and from other European trade union movements. But in return, there will be an element of kind of like you're going to have to start thinking about an element of ending your discrimination and the homophobia that